Cool. Hi. Welcome to another Raise3D live stream. Today we will be going over applications in multi-material printing. So we'll be looking primarily at PLA and PVA, how you would set up both of those on the Pro 2 versus the E2, and the differences between the single head system and the IDEX system. And then later we'll be going into Idea Maker for how you would set up the PVA, PLA prints, and then getting a little bit into how you would be setting up templates or materials for getting into a bit more experimental applications. So first thing we're dealing with the materials themselves. We're working with PLA and PVA. This is a dissolvable support structure for all of this support in here. So when this is printed, we'll have one nozzle dedicated to the PLA support material, and then the second nozzle will be dedicated to running the supports. Once this is printed, this is left in a hot water bath, and then all of that dissolves away. So then what we'd be left with finally is this part, which again has all of that material dissolved away, and it is all fully functional. So it's a lot easier to remove materials if you're working with kind of the dual applications like this. Using one single material or two rigid materials would be a lot more difficult to get all the supports out. So that's a huge plus to have dual extruder machines be able to run both materials like this. Going into differences on the machines themselves, the Pro 2 runs a single printhead that runs both individual nozzles in order to run dual material parts. So when we have things loaded, we'll have two spools loaded into the side, and then they both run up to the top of the same printhead. While this is printing, the way that it has to go through switching in order to run a dual print is it will run everything through one side of the extruder, run out of one nozzle, then it shifts down and lowers the right nozzle, and then uses the same printhead to print out that right side. So it would go essentially over the print in one area using one nozzle, switch, and then go over the same area with the same printhead. The main thing to notice is that the secondary nozzle is still with the same printhead, so it's going to be going over the same print. One thing that we have to deal with a lot when we are working with dual materials is any time that the hot end is not actively extruding, it's typically still heated, which allows the material to be more in a fluid state and ooze out of the nozzle due to gravity. So when we're working with a single printhead system, we need to combat that by either lowering the temperature or adjusting the retraction settings for that material so it doesn't ooze over the part while we are using the same printhead to go over that same section with the other nozzle. The IDEX system, we switch over to the E2. This one with its IDEX system runs two individual printheads. Go ahead and bring the left one over here as well. So we have two completely independent printheads on the same linear X rail. So whenever we're running a dual print for this machine, again, it would be single print dual material. The E2 is also capable of duplication and mirror mode, but that's using both heads simultaneously for two separate parts. Dual material would be using both heads for a single part. In that case, it is going to park one head entirely off onto the side, and then print using one of the other print heads. Once this is finished, it moves over, leaves that in its side position, and then brings the other print head in to move it over. So whereas the Pro 2 has both nozzles kind of constantly going over the same area of the part, the E2 is able to completely remove one of those nozzles as needed, so the ooze is not going to be as severe or risk being run over the part as you're doing it with this system. It will still, however, use a wipe wall and wipe tower just to clean off any of the ooze that's going to collect there on the sides, but we don't have to worry about having excessive ooze over the part while it is printing with the IDEX system. So that's the main difference between both machines. We are now in Idea Maker, and I'll go ahead and go through the setup for PVA. The general setup for PVA on the Pro 2. If I go ahead and bring in one of our example models. Basic setup for that, once you have it in the machine and fully dried. Again, we had another stream earlier covering the print dry and PVA setup, so if you want to get brushed up on that, highly recommend that one. We're going into the actual setup in Idea Maker. We'll want to start slicing up at the top. This opens up the template selection menu. And then from here, I do already have a template set up on the side for running the PVA PLA prints. So if I was going to set up a brand new template, I can start with the stock standard Pro 2 PLA, and then want to go to edit and get into the advanced settings. We'll be adjusting a number of these. I just went ahead and clicked restore defaults down here. So I am working with essentially a clean version of this template. Be the same thing if it was just downloaded from a new version of ID Maker. And then it'll usually default to PLA for both sides. So we would want to change the right extruder to PVA first. And there are two different versions of PVA. There's one for the Pro 2 and then a specific side one for the PVA 1.75 millimeter for the E2. So they do run different profiles. That's one to keep in mind. So if running on the Pro 2s, we'll use PVA. And then inside of the PVA setting, clicking this gear icon here will allow me to get into the template settings themselves. Opening up the template settings, there's a number of overrides built into this material. And this checkbox here will enable those overrides. So anytime that this filament is set to the right side, it is going to change the settings of whatever template it's being applied to. Now the defaults for PVA, I recommend just kind of keeping them as is. We can go in here, and if I wanted to tweak the support pattern for one, typically I'll run a gyroid pattern just so things dissolve a bit quicker. That can be adjusted in here. So if I change that to gyroid, and then I'll just save that. So I can make small changes according to that, the PVA overrides in there. And that's also what we'll be using later for setting up a different combination of materials. For the template itself, once we have PVA on the right side, to set up the new kind of PVA PLA template here, I want to go into edit, and then under the extruder tab, go to the right extruder and enable the right extruder configuration. This allows the left and right extruders to run different settings from each other. So in the case of PVA, PVA likes to extrude at a 0.5 millimeter extrusion width compared to the 0.4 for PLA. So we don't want to have those be separate. If that box is unchecked, it defaults everything back to the main page for the left extruder. So we would be essentially having a lower extrusion width than what we want if this box is unchecked when running PVA. Under the support tab, just for running the PVA supports, I want to set those to all. And then under the support extruder, set that to the right extruder. And there's also the option for dense supports, just running those other layers of supports on top of the main support structure. Those can be specified for the left or right extruder individually as well. So in the case of a large part that we just want to have the PVA supporting the part itself, but not using it for the entire support structure, since it is an expensive material, I can typically just have the right extruder set to the dense supports and then run a version of interface layers to make sure that I'm not using all the material all the time. Under the temperature tab, this one is going to be more important for the Pro 2s, like I mentioned, with those nozzles kind of oozing from the single print head. We want to enable the option to cool down the inactive extruder. This is going to lower the temperatures of whichever extruder is not currently being used to the set temperature in this area. And then it's going to essentially heat them back up before it starts extruding again. And that's going to cut down on the ooze when the extruders are not being used. And then the last ones here would be running the wipe wall and wipe tower. Those are enabled by the PVA override, so those are going to stay on. The other setting that I will typically want to have enabled is to stop printing the wipe wall and wipe tower if just one extruder is being used. If that is unchecked, it's going to continue printing the wipe wall and wipe tower for the entire part, even if it's not going to be switching material anymore. So if we just have that on, it's going to only print the part and only print what is needed and not continue printing the wipe wall. So printing PETG, it can be used with PVA or HIPS, I believe. HIPS might be a little bit more in the, you want to keep the lid on for that material. It prints closer to ABS, like 250. So it would depend more on the brand of PETG that you're running and how sensitive that one is to temperatures. But it could work with either one. Yes, and Mungo was asking about the settings. There is a page on our website that covers the breakdown for setting up PVA, so we can get that in the chat. That would work as well. And there's also versions for running the wipe wall and wipe tower in the different versions of interlaced and nested. So I'll just have our tower set to nested so we can see the difference for that. And then once I have that saved, I've just edited this main template. In order to get this side PVA PLA template, I can actually go ahead and just duplicate this one. And then this will be essentially our new PVA PLA template. So I have that saved off to the side. If I then go back and restore the defaults for the stock template again, then I can actually use the compare option and just view the differences between those two templates now. Everything in here would be the supports are enabled, set to the right extruder, same thing for the dense supports, and then we see the options for inactive extruder cooldown and the option for the wipe wall to be disabled. Everything else is being handled by the PVA overrides. So then when I slice with the new template, keeping those overrides in mind, going into the preview, I just want to make sure that I'm looking at the correct version of the wipe wall and wipe tower, and then changing it to the extruder color view just lets me see all of the parts and supports as they're being sliced. And then the main difference between that interlaced and nested settings for the wipe wall and wipe tower, interlaced will run the materials in alternating layers on top of each other, whereas nested will run concentric rings for the wipe wall and wipe tower if it's both enabled. So I can help cut down on a little bit of material for the tower since it just prints the shells rather than the full layer. And then it can add a little bit of extra strength for the wipe wall because you're going to have those parts bonding on top of the same material rather than alternating layers. Moving into the E2, it's going to be pretty much the same type of setup. We just want to have PLA for the left and then PVA E2 for the right extruder. And then we want to, again, go back in to the extruder tab, enable the right extruder configuration. We can adjust the support settings. On this one, I'll go ahead and run the main supports out of the left and the dense supports out of the right extruder. The inactive extruder cooldown is enabled by the E2 override, so that's where we would want to keep that on or adjust it. And then again, the wipe wall and wipe tower are enabled, and then on the E2s, the option to stop printing the wipe wall is enabled by default. So then this would be the result for the E2 PVA print. In this version, I do have just the dense support set to PVA, so that's where we're seeing these interface layers. Running this and then dissolving the supports out would essentially leave us with the main part structure and then just the blocks of supports that would fall away. That's basically the general setup for PVA and PLA prints. We do have all of those settings pre-built into Idea Maker. If you did want to experiment running different types of material combinations together, the main thing to keep in mind is the temperature compatibility. So in the case of ABS and HIPs, those still roughly print at about 250 extruder temp and a 100C bed temperature. Printing something like PLA and ABS together, PLA prints at around a 215 extruder temperature. We run ours at 205 and then a 60 bed temperature. Running PLA in the environment necessary to keep ABS from warping, running the bed at 100C with the lid on and the machine fully enclosed, is likely to jam the PLA material. So those two are not typically considered to be compatible. But if you're working with things that are going to be roughly in the same temperature range, as long as they will extrude, then we can try and run them together. The other thing to keep in mind is the layer adhesion between two materials. So we mentioned before a little bit, I'm running a PETG in combination. PETG doesn't typically like to stick to other materials, so that one can be tricky to work with. Another one would be trying to run something like a flexible material with another one as well. Those can be a little bit in a lower temperature range, and TPU tends to ooze pretty aggressively. So we would want to be adjusting things in the wipe wall and retraction in order to work those out. But the way that you would set those up, once you know what the temperature settings are and kind of what flows you'd be working with, there are a few different ways to specify those sections. So if I'm working with, I'll go ahead and bring in one of these files. So working with these two bodies. Once I have these two parts in here, first thing I want to do is select both of them. And then since they are modeled in order to, basically one will fit inside of the other to run those dual prints, I can right click and then choose to align selected models. And that's going to bring the two models together according to their origin points. So as long as they're modeled referencing the same origin, they should line up exactly. And then I can select one of these two bodies, and then using the view tool, designate left or right extruder. So now I have this one, the bodies are assigned to run left and right. That's the main thing you'd be looking for running multi-material. Then once we have that material set up, or the model set up for left and right, I'll go ahead and run back to the standard kind of PLA setup. If I wanted to run, we'll do something like a PLA, and then let's see, if we want to do just like a higher temperature PVA or a higher temperature PLA, or like an ABS and a HIPS. Whatever the temperatures that you're working with, typically I'll start with duplicating the template. So this one can be our kind of hybrid that we'll be working with. And the main thing is we want to set the temperatures for those two materials, kind of similar to how the PVA one was set up. So in here, we have the overrides for the extrusion width, type of supports that we'll be running, the main temperatures in here, and the flow rate for any given material. Or if I add or duplicate, add in a new material, I can also enable the overrides and start adding in essentially custom overrides for whatever material I'm working with. So, for example, if we did like a PETG on the right side, this one does already have the extruder temperature built in as an override. So when I have PETG set to the right, going into any given template, under the temperatures here, it's just going to change this to its override, which would be 255. The alternative to that would just be keeping a material that doesn't have overrides built in. That is then not going to affect the template. I can just have this specific template run as a PETG and then whatever other material hybrid. And that would just be by setting the specific settings for the material in here individually. Same thing with the right extruder settings, and having those be set for the different extruder. So then it would be this one specific template would work as a one that you could slice for the two different materials, but everything would be run through one template rather than having a little bit more of the flexibility running with the override where you can apply this onto different templates. So the one way of running it through is setting up an override or just setting up a template with the two different settings for, again, temperatures. Under the advanced settings, you have the options for flow, and then we can also adjust the individual region of the part, of course, based on what is being printed for what section. The other way that we could set up running the two parts in different materials is separating them into group and layer settings. So on the group and layer settings tab, I have the option to enable and add in another setting group and move certain bodies into that group. So now that I have two separate groups, we have the per group settings. In here, this allows me to essentially add in overrides similar to the same material, but specifically for individual bodies within the part, and I can vary it between essentially as many bodies as I have here. So for setting group 1, if we're keeping that with, we'll say like a default PLA, then we can keep this at the default template. We'll go back and restore that back to our defaults, and then just enable our supports. So I'm working with stock, and I'll have that sliced. And then setting group 1 will run just off of the default support structures, or just off the default template. Settings group 2 is where I can go ahead and add in the other settings for adjusting things like the flow would be in here, some of the retraction settings as well. So we can adjust the retraction material amount, or things like adjusting the ooze. There's a couple other settings in here that we want to do. It looks like the temperatures are actually going to be controlled in the main template. So if there's a couple other settings we wanted to do for group and layer settings, all of these are going to be in this main list. So things like performing Z-hop and the difference in adjusting flow would probably work better in the group and layer settings if you're working with specific models that tend to ooze a bit more, and then just have the main template dedicated for the different temperatures of the materials that you'd be running. There are a couple other things in how you would run the wipe wall and wipe tower in order to deal with the ooze section. Because depending on the material that you're running, it is going to be messier than running a single print. So being able to customize the wipe wall and wipe tower gives you that extra kind of flexibility that you would need in order to combat certain materials. The main one that I tend to work with is using a larger wipe tower. We do have the option to adjust the wipe tower width, and then either run it in, again, like I mentioned earlier, nested mode, or run it in multiple mode, which will run 2 completely separate towers. So if I really want to be able to clean that out, have a fully printed layer before moving on to the piece itself, then I can run them in multiple. There's also the option for the wipe tower offset. I can adjust the distance for how far the tower should be away from the part, and that in turn is going to affect how much it's allowed to ooze as it moves from the part back to the tower and switches through those 2 portions. So if I were to bring this a bit closer, do a 5 offset, keeping those in here, and then also the angle of the tower. There's options for adjusting the way that it contours to the part. If we're working with the contoured setting, it will match the part as closely as it can, going both inwards and outwards as the part geometry changes. The waterfall portion will only essentially start at the footprint of the part, go all the way up, and then contour in, but it will never contour back out. And then vertical, of course, is just going to be straight up and down for that portion. So we'll keep it on vertical and then have the tower off to the side. And going through the extruder color, again, the entire left and right portions of this should print as needed, and it's all going to be according to temperature settings for the materials and then the environment that they're running in. That's going to cover a rundown on running dual material for both the Pro 2 and the E2, setting up PVA, and then kind of the steps that you would go through to start experimenting with other material combinations and the settings for those. Again, if you do have any questions, go to support.raise3d.com and then ask our tech team, and then we can also help out with anything else that you're working on. But thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.